Hello, health champions. I just finished eating nothing for 100 hours. And today I want to talk about what happened to my blood work before and after, as well as to some markers that you can track yourself while you're fasting. So 100 hours is the same as 4 days and 4 hours, obviously. And during that time, I had nothing but water and black coffee. So no milk, no butter, nothing like that. 0 calories. And as a result, I burned off a lot of body weight. So I lost about 7 pounds in that time, about 3 kilos. But as you also probably know by now, if you've been watching this channel, is that most of the weight you lose in the beginning is water. You're losing glycogen, you're burning through the glycogen, which is stored carbohydrate. And as you've used up your glycogen, then that releases water because the glycogen binds water and then there's nothing to hold it, so you flush out the water. And as soon as you start eating again, about half of that is going to come right back. But you still will burn some fat. However, weight loss is not the primary reason that you want to do this. This is a little bit drastic. You don't want to do that all the time just to lose weight. But we're going to talk about what some of the benefits are. And the markers that you can track yourself through a little finger prick is glucose and ketones. And then what you can do is you can calculate a glucose-ketone ratio, a GKI or index. And in doing that, you can get a rough idea of how deep into autophagy you are. So there's no simple way of measuring autophagy. That can only be done in a lab setting with very sophisticated equipment. But you can get an idea by using this GKI ratio. And why are we interested in autophagy? It is because it stimulates all sorts of positive health effects. And one would be that it stimulates sirtuins, which are survival genes. And it also stimulates immune function, and it has been shown to be potential for cancer prevention or even in some cases cancer reversal, because cancer lives off, it thrives in a high sugar environment. So when you fast and your glucose drops and your ketones go up, then that's a very inhospitable environment for the cancer cells, and you can actually starve the cancer cells doing that. And autophagy is also something that can extend life, so it's great for longevity. But the other big reason that you might want to consider a longer fast once in a while is that you can break through plateaus. If you've done keto, if you've done intermittent fasting, you've had some results, but then you sort of plateau. A longer fast can be a very powerful way to break through that. And if you had a plateau regarding weight, if you had a plateau regarding insulin, that maybe you monitor your insulin and you dropped some insulin, you are moving away from type 2 diabetes and you had some success, but then that insulin just plateaus, a longer fast can break through that. So very often what you find with low carb and intermittent fasting is that you will drop your glucose relatively quickly, maybe not to the exact level that you're looking for, but it will typically drop a good bit. Your triglycerides will drop, your blood fats, but very often insulin is kind of stubborn. That's one of the more valuable long-term markers for insulin resistance. So here's what happened to me. And let me start with the home markers, the stuff that you can measure yourself at home during the fast. So glucose and ketones. And we're going to measure after so many hours, and we're going to calculate that glucose ketone index, that ratio. And we're going to measure this in millimoles, and I explain in just a second. So after 24 hours, my blood glucose was 90. And the way you convert that to millimoles, because 90 is milligrams per deciliter, so you divide the 90 by 18 and you get 5.0. So now you have glucose in millimoles, so you can compare that to the ketones, which are usually given in millimoles when you do the finger prick. And at that time, my ketones were 0.5. So I was not in ketosis when I started this. If you start off being in ketosis, so that you're kind of at this level of 0.5, 0.8 when you begin, you'll probably get some higher numbers quicker. So we divide this out and we find out that my GKI was 10, which is not very much autophagy at all. After almost twice as long, 44 hours, my glucose was about the same and my ketones hadn't moved much either. My GKI was 7, so still not very significant. If you had started out in ketosis, then by 44 hours, you would probably see a much, much lower GKI. After 56 hours, though, the glucose had still not changed much, but now my ketones were really getting up in there. So 0.7 is just starting to get into ketosis. 2.4 is significant nutritional ketosis, and my ratio is now down to 2. A few hours later, at 72 hours, now my glucose is dropping a little bit. As the ketones go up, the body doesn't need as much glucose because the brain relies more on the ketones. So now the body doesn't have to engage in so much gluconeogenesis or making new glucose. And at this point, my ketones are up to 4 and my ratio is right around 1. And they've done some research where they found that you can reverse certain tumors. And the level where that starts happening was around a GKI of 1. And very often you'll see that the ketones are kind of sluggish in the beginning, but then they really pick up speed, especially if you don't eat anything at all. And after 80 hours, my glucose was still about the same, but my ketones were up to 5.6, and my ratio now is below 1. So even more significant ketosis, and probably most likely, like we don't know for sure about autophagy, but we can say pretty certain that that is a very deep state of autophagy. After 90 hours, my glucose starts dropping significantly and my ketones are going up a little more. So now I'm at 0.6. And at 98 hours, just before I went to the lab, my glucose was 558 in milligrams, 3.2 in millimoles, and my ketones were up to 6.5, which is probably the highest that I have ever measured. Some people will measure up to maybe 7 or 8, but beyond that, you want to be really, really careful because then that might indicate that you are actually having type 1 diabetes. But if that happens, if this goes even higher and it becomes a problem, then you're probably not going to see the glucose drop at the same time. And that's where it can get dangerous. So this is still perfectly healthy and normal. And at this point now, my GKI is 0.5. And I know that I probably have a very significant amount of autophagy. But then let's look at the blood work. And we're going to look at a number of different markers. We're going to look at glucose control, electrolytes, and cholesterol and lipids. So when it came to glucose, when I started, I had 90. And when I went to the lab, they measured 55. And some people would say that that is too low. It's definitely below the normal range on the lab because they cut it off like typically at 70 or 75. But again, when your ketones go up, you don't need that much glucose. So that is perfectly fine and nothing to worry about. Even if you get into the 40s or even high 30s, if your ketones are high and you're feeling good, that's not a problem. The A1C is more of a long-term marker, so we don't expect that to change. So I did see a little bit of a drop, 5.3 to 5.1, and in only about 4.5 days, that's probably more of a change than I would expect. But we also have to keep in mind that there's a margin of error. So this might be closer to 5.2, and this might also be closer to 5.2. We don't know exactly what those numbers are. And I also measured insulin, which I always do, and I started off at 3.2 and I finished at 0.9. So the normal range goes from about 2 to 5, so 3.2 is right in that optimal range. 0.9 is really low, but that's to be expected after 4 days of fasting. But what it also means is that when your insulin tends to drop that low, then you're not a person that has to be extremely strict with carbohydrate, not as strict as someone who's trying to reverse diabetes or a metabolic condition. It doesn't mean you should start eating bread and rice, but it means you don't have to be as strict, and you can probably have 50, 60, 70 grams of carbs and still maintain perfect metabolic health. Triglycerides are blood fat, and when you're not eating, then obviously they have to come either from converting glucose or from burning body fat. And since I'm not eating any glucose either, the body is not going to convert glucose into triglycerides. So these are coming entirely from the body fat. And 60 is a pretty low level, and my triglycerides actually went up a little bit. But again, within the margin of error, we would say that this is no change at all. And a lot of people would think that when you're not eating anything, then the triglycerides would be super, super low. But we're burning body fat. It has to get into the bloodstream to get into the cells. And it's not going to change much if you're already fat adapted, because all the fat that gets into the bloodstream is going to also get into the cells relatively quickly. So that's why there's a quick turnover, and this is a very stable number. And then one of my favorite markers for determining insulin resistance is HOMA-IR, Homeostatic Model Assessment of Insulin Resistance. So you take the glucose, you multiply by the insulin, you divide by 405 if you're measuring the glucose in milligrams. And a typical really good number would be 1.0. That means you are metabolically balanced, that you are insulin sensitive, you're not too extreme in either direction. And I started out at 0.7, so I was a little bit on the insulin sensitive side, but after 4 days of fasting, I was at 0.1. Now, that's not something to brag or write home about. That's just saying that this was an extreme state, that after 4 days of fasting, the body is going to have very, very low glucose and also virtually no insulin, because there's no glucose in the bloodstream to push into the cells. So everything is kind of on the back burner there. And here's a super important one to understand when you're fasting, because one of the first things that's going to happen is when you lose some glycogen, that glycogen binds water, and when you lose water, you also lose minerals. And the minerals that we want to watch for are sodium, potassium, chloride, and CO2. So these aren't technically minerals per se, but this is what you watch on a blood test. The other minerals that are of interest are calcium and magnesium. But as far as pH and the main big electrolytes, these are the ones we're looking for. And sodium is a positive ion. It has a positive charge. Potassium has a positive charge. But chloride and CO2 have a negative charge. And when CO2 shows up on your blood work, they're not actually talking about carbon dioxide, because the body has this mechanism where it instantly dissolves and it goes back and forth between bicarbonate and carbonic acid. So don't worry about the names. Just know that when CO2 is on your blood work, what they're really talking about is bicarbonate, which is a buffering agent. It's alkaline and it helps neutralize acid. And here's why we care about that, because now we can take the positive ions and we can take the negative ions. We subtract the negative ions from the positive and we get something called anion gap. And this is a measure of your acidity, because the higher this is, the more hydrogen ions, the more positive ions you have, and the more acidic you are. So if you do a keto diet or if you do a fasting diet, intermittent fasting, then you tend to run a little bit acidic, which is not necessarily a problem. But once you start fasting, you could end up on the acidic side. So when I started out, I had sodium was 141, potassium 4.9, chloride 101, and CO2 was 25. So we subtract the negative from the positive, and my ion-ion gap was 20. But after 4 days, sodium had dropped, potassium had increased a little bit, chloride, which again is sodium chloride, it's table salt. Sodium and chloride go together. So if you notice, the sodium and the chloride dropped together. And the CO2 was the biggest difference here, because as I turned a little acidic, the body was using up the bicarbonate to buffer the acid. And that's what happens. If you run a little acidic, then you're going to deplete your bicarbonate. And therefore, my anion gap went up to 27. And 20 isn't necessarily a problem, even if it's a little higher than typical, but 27 is starting to get a little too acidic. So what you want to do is you want to take an electrolyte powder. And I designed a powder specifically for this. It's called Ulite. We'll put a link down below. And when I did my live stream about that powder, I told everybody that the main minerals in there are the ones that are a little harder to get, like potassium and magnesium and calcium. And therefore, I put quite a bit of those in there along with some other things. But I didn't put a lot of sodium because that's just table salt. And you don't have to go and pay expensive products to get sodium. You just supplement with some table salt. So what I told people is you take the electrolyte powder and then you take some salt on the side. You always drink water and you put a pinch of salt in as you go. Unfortunately, I didn't take my own advice, which is why the sodium and the chloride dropped so much. I basically forgot about that. So don't forget about it. So basically, once you do a fast like this, you want to increase your salt, your sodium chloride, and it's also a good idea to take some baking soda because that is sodium bicarbonate. So then you replenish and you give your body some extra bicarbonate. And you don't need a ton of it, but if you're fasting, I would probably do like half a teaspoon a day. And then we get to the cholesterol and the lipids, which is where there's probably the most misconceptions. Everybody thinks that it is a certain way, and it's kind of the other way around. And my total cholesterol went from 220 to 255. So that's a huge shock to most people, because where's the cholesterol coming from if you're not eating anything? Because we hear so much about you need to restrict your dietary cholesterol because then that if you eat a lot of cholesterol, that raises your blood cholesterol. Well, I ate nothing, 0 calories, and mine went up. And the reason is, first of all, your body makes cholesterol as needed. The other reason is that you actually store some cholesterol in your body tissues. So as you start burning body fat, then your cholesterol can actually go up a little bit. And then my LDL went from 146 to 169. So both total cholesterol and LDL, which we hear all the time are bad, both of those went up. So does that mean that fasting is bad for you? Well, you hear so much about fasting, about low carb, about how we have to eat bread and we have to eat rice to give the brain power. So there are so many myths and misconceptions that it's not so strange if people would draw that conclusion. But these two numbers, and we'll talk about this in detail, the total cholesterol and the LDL are completely irrelevant. What we want to focus on are some other markers, and one of those is HDL, and that one weighed from 63 to 76. So when we look at a ratio of total cholesterol to HDL, which is a very common ratio to assess cardiovascular risk, we see that I was at 3.5, which is a good number, and I went to 3.4, which is a slightly better number. But as long as you're in this range, then you don't really have to worry about it. And if your cholesterol is really high, like 350, 400, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are unhealthy, and then you will probably never hit this ratio, and you still don't necessarily want to worry about it. So what you really want to look at is the LDL-P, which is the particle count. Normally, this LDL is measured in milligram. It's the total amount, the total mass, whereas what really matters is the LDL-P, the particle count. And also, we want the particle size, the LDL particles that are smaller than 20.5 nanometers. Those are the ones that can actually create some damage and that reflect a lot of oxidative stress and inflammation. So usually we hear that HDL is good and LDL is bad, but in fact, there is good and bad LDL. And what I would say normal and damaged LDL. So a healthy LDL particle should be between 21.5 and 23. They could be a little outside that range, but the majority of them should be in that range. And here's why the particle count is much more important than the actual amount of milligrams. So if we have a container, imaginary container, and we stuff that full of small LDL particles, we could fit a whole bunch of these small LDL particles in there. There'd be a high count for a given volume. And then if we had another container and we stuffed that one full with larger particles, then for a given volume, we would fit much, much fewer. So even though they might look the same, or this one might even be a little higher in terms of milligram, this is a much better situation than this, because it's the number that counts. So having a bunch of large LDL is totally okay, whereas having a bunch of small ones is not so great. So how did they go from large and normal to become small? And there are things like insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and oxidative stress. These are the main factors that will damage LDL and shrink them. Overall, we would call these three things poor metabolic health. And these things are what shrinks them and turns them from large and fluffy to damaged and potentially bad. But here's the interesting thing, that even though my total cholesterol numbers went up when I fasted and ate nothing, fasting has been shown to reverse all of this. And we saw that with my glucose, with my A1C, with my insulin, with my HOMA-IR, all of those went down. And if this can reverse all of them, then let's look at what happened to the size. So like I just mentioned, my LDL measured in milligrams went from 146 to 169, which is a 16% increase. But at the same time, when we look at the particle count, it went from 1709 to 1222, which is a 30% drop. So overall, we can surely see that my particles went from small to bigger. And one more way to verify that is to count the small particles, the ones that are less than 20.5 nanometers, and that went from 351 to less than 90. And that's just how the lab reports them. When there's so few they can basically not count them, then they just put less than 90. So percentage-wise, if you look at the small LDL compared to the total count of LDL, I started out at about 20% and I finished at less than 7%. And another way of looking at this, very often you might hear that the ApoB is a much better marker, much better indicator for heart disease risk. And what does that mean? Well, the ApoB is a protein, And each LDL molecule has exactly one, and it kind of winds its way in and out of the cell membrane. So one LDL molecule equals one ApoB protein. And that's basically the exact same thing that I'm showing you, that if my LDL particle count went from 1709, then the ApoB proteins also reduced by the same amount. And even though I had a dramatic change, I went from 20% small particles to less than 7, I didn't start in a very bad place because the average is right around 53%. That's the cutoff that they consider as average health when you have 530 particles out of 1,000 total. But in my mind, the percentage is more important than the total number. So overall, we can definitely see that we had a change, that we know going from large to small indicates oxidative stress, inflammation, and increased risk of heart disease. So during 4 days of fasting, I dramatically reversed that trend. And here's what I would recommend about intermittent fasting. I would suggest you stop snacking. There's no reason whatsoever for snacking, especially high carb snacks. Then I think that a good number of meals for most people is to eat once or twice a day. I typically eat somewhere mostly 2 times a day, sometimes once a day, depending on schedule mostly. And if you are not trying to reverse a condition, if you're more active, if you're insulin sensitive, or if you have trouble eating very large amounts of food at one sitting, if your absorption, if your digestion doesn't work, doesn't tolerate very large meals, then you can try breaking them up in smaller meals and maybe eat 3 times a day. I would still suggest that you eat those 3 meals within an 8 to 10 hour time period. And I would suggest that you combine that with anywhere from 20 to 100 grams of carbs per day. And again, this is a general range. It's pretty wide, but it depends on where are you starting from. Are you trying to reverse diabetes? Then you definitely want to be at the lower end of this. If you're more insulin sensitive, more active, a larger person, then you might be closer to 100. All depends on your goal and where you are on the spectrum. So at some point, I would suggest that you find out how insulin resistant you are. To get some blood work, figure out your HOMA-IR. Now, if you just stop eating sugar and bread and you drop 60 pounds in 2 weeks, you don't strictly have to find this out because you're getting results no matter what. But if you have tried different things and you don't get the results, or your weight is stubborn, or you plateau, then it would be an excellent idea to figure out how insulin resistant you are. Where are you on the spectrum? Know what your HOMA-IR is and how it's changing. Then I would suggest that you skip a day entirely and you do a 42-hour fast. And the reason I say 42 hours is if you have dinner and you skip a whole day, then the morning that you wake up after that, you've done 36 hours. So if you don't eat right away, you wait till lunch, then you have somewhere around 42 hours. And I would do that for most people, just get a little autophagy. I would do that maybe once a month, maybe twice a month. If you are reversing insulin resistant, if you're a diabetic, then you can do it more often. I would say to do it maybe once a week or even twice a week. It all depends on how things are moving on their own. If you're not getting the results, do a little bit more. And then, like the fast that I just finished here, I would suggest that you do a 3 to 5 day fast, maybe every quarter, maybe twice a year. So 2 to 4 times per year. And the reason for that is that you get a great cleanse, you get a great reset, you get deep, deep autophagy, and you can potentially clean up or prevent some cancer cells in the process. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.